The narrator described how the early morning over Siberia was unnervingly still, the taiga stretching endless under pale dawn light. Trees whispered with an unnatural hush, as if the forest itself anticipated something monstrous. In a remote encampment, Edward Clark said, the sky feels heavy, like it's holding its breath. Amelia Brooks said, the birds vanished hours ago, even the wolves are silent. The narrator detailed a sudden shimmer on the horizon, an unearthly glow that split the sky with silver veins. Edward Clark stepped forward through frost-stiff grass, heart pounding with dread. A soundless flash ignited the heavens, turning night to blazing noon. The narrator recounted the forest quaking, wildlife scattering in blind panic. Amelia Brooks cried, "Edward, it's coming from the east. Run!" The ground convulsed, tossing logs and tents like toys. Trees splintered. A deafening roar followed seconds later, smashing everything flat for miles. The narrator told of a mushrooming pillar of fire rising above the tundra, its light painting Edward Clark's terrified face. Sparks rained like burning snow, and the taiga burned beneath a sky ripped apart. The narrator described the bitter cold settling again after the blast, the taiga's silence broken only by distant cracking trees. Edward Clark said, "The world feels broken, as if the sky tore apart." Amelia Brooks said, "Edward, this isn't a meteor. Look at the patterns on the ground." The narrator observed twisted trees spiraling outward, forming an unnatural ring. Edward Clark stepped cautiously, boots crunching over shattered bark, his breath shallow. A flicker of movement in the haze caught Amelia Brooks' eye. Far away, a shadowy figure stood, then vanished. Edward Clark said, "Someone else is out here." The narrator recounted the smell of scorched resin and ozone, the air tasting metallic. Amelia Brooks said, "We have to record everything before the evidence is gone." A strange hum vibrated beneath their feet, faint but growing. The narrator revealed how Edward's pulse quickened as the land itself seemed alive. The narrator detailed Edward Clark poring over Amelia Brooks' hastily sketched map by a small campfire. Amelia Brooks said, "Every eyewitness account I found mentioned a strange glow days before the blast." Edward Clark said, "Then someone knew this would happen." The narrator described how sparks drifted upward, stars hidden behind soot-filled clouds. Amelia Brooks whispered, "What if it wasn't nature at all?" The narrator recounted the fire popping, sending shadows dancing across their weary faces. Edward Clark said, "If someone orchestrated this, they'll kill to keep it buried." A distant howl cut through the night, too distorted to be a wolf. The narrator spoke of their unease tightening like a noose, the forest feeling watchful. Amelia Brooks said, "We're not alone out here, Edward." Edward Clark said, "Then we'll keep moving east at first light." The narrator explained how at dawn, Edward Clark and Amelia Brooks approached the abandoned meteorological station on the tundra's edge. Frost clung to broken instruments dangling from wires. Edward Clark said, "If this station recorded the blast, its logs might prove everything." Amelia Brooks said, "Then someone erased the truth." The narrator described shattered glass crunching beneath their boots as they entered. A trace of footprints crossed the snow, fresh and deliberate. Edward Clark said, "We're being followed." Amelia Brooks whispered, "Or led." The narrator told of the distant rumble echoing under the ice, a sound that seemed purposeful. Edward Clark said, "This was no asteroid, Amelia." The narrator revealed a small, charred notebook hidden beneath debris, its pages singed yet legible. The narrator described the pair trekking eastward toward the suspected blast epicenter, smoke plumes still rising in the distance. Edward Clark said, "This devastation stretches farther than reports claim." Amelia Brooks said, "Edward, the trees bend outward in perfect symmetry." The narrator emphasized the unnatural precision of the destruction, as if guided by design. A glimmer of metal half buried in ash caught Edward Clark's eye. He brushed it free. A fragment of unfamiliar alloy, smooth and curved. Edward Clark said, "This isn't from any meteor I know." Amelia Brooks said, "Then what tore Siberia apart?" The narrator described the sky darkening briefly as another distant rumble rolled. Their breath steamed in the frigid air as unease shadowed their faces. Edward Clark said, "Whatever did this might still be watching." The narrator conveyed the silent dread, wrapping the frozen land like a shroud. The narrator described Edward Clark sliding the charred notebook across a rickety table in a dim archive chamber beneath a remote research post. Dust motes floated like ghosts in the lantern glow. Edward Clark said, "These pages survived the fire for a reason." Amelia Brooks said, "Someone tried to destroy every trace but missed this." The narrator recounted their breath forming fog in the frigid air as wind howled outside. Edward Clark flipped to a burned entry showing coordinates east of Tunguska. Amelia Brooks said, "It points deeper into the blast zone." The narrator explained how unease tightened their chests. Edward Clark said, "If the Keeper of Secrets learns we found this, they'll erase us too." A distant door creaked above, echoing like a warning. The narrator noted their shared glance, a silent vow to press on despite the danger. The narrator described Edward Clark and Amelia Brooks trudging through waist-deep snow toward a collapsed observation tower at dawn. Broken beams jutted like splinters against a gray horizon. Amelia Brooks said, "The logs here could confirm the trajectory of whatever struck." Edward Clark said, "If any survived this wreck." The narrator noted the wind slicing through their coats as distant crows circled silently overhead. Edward Clark brushed snow from a twisted metal box and forced it open. Inside, frostbitten log sheets bore symbols neither recognized. Amelia Brooks whispered, "This script isn't Russian or Evenki." The narrator recounted a low hum beneath their boots, a reminder of the lingering anomaly. Edward Clark said, "This can't be natural." The narrator described the sky dimming as clouds thickened, the world shrinking to an eerie hush around them. The narrator described Edward Clark and Amelia Brooks warming their hands near a dying campfire as twilight deepened over the tundra. Snow hissed softly against glowing embers. Edward Clark said, "Someone has been tracking us since the station." Amelia Brooks said, "I felt eyes on us the entire way back." The narrator revealed a figure emerging from the shadows. Lucas Grant approached with a calm smile, his fur-lined hood pulled low. Lucas Grant said, "You're seeking answers in the wrong places." The narrator noted how the flames cast long, shifting shadows across the three faces. Edward Clark said, "Who are you to warn us?" Lucas Grant said, "A friend, or perhaps not." The narrator recounted the sudden flick of wind that nearly snuffed the fire, leaving a tense silence. Amelia Brooks whispered, "His timing is too perfect." The narrator described the trio trudging deeper into the blast zone under a sky heavy with slate clouds. Flattened pines stretched for miles, their trunks pointing away from an invisible center. Amelia Brooks said, "This symmetry is unnatural, like a planned demolition." Edward Clark said, "Or a weapon test." Lucas Grant said, "Careful with your words. Others might be listening." The narrator recounted their breath fogging as a low rumble passed beneath their boots. Edward Clark crouched to examine scorched soil, noting metallic residue. Amelia Brooks said, "It feels deliberate, Edward." The narrator highlighted the distant cry of a raven, echoing eerily across the barren expanse. Lucas Grant said, "Some secrets are guarded by more than men." The narrator described a flicker of light on the horizon, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The narrator described their small camp, set beneath a shattered ridge as night fell, the wind carrying a faint electric hum. Edward Clark said, "We can't stay here long. Someone wants us gone." Amelia Brooks said, "But these symbols need decoding tonight." The narrator detailed Lucas Grant spreading the strange log sheets, tracing symbols with a gloved finger. Lucas Grant said, "These aren't random. They're coordinates, but to what?" The narrator revealed the firelight flickering over their determined faces. Edward Clark said, "If it leads to proof, the Keeper of Secrets won't forgive us." Amelia Brooks whispered, "Then we must be faster than their reach." The narrator described sparks spiraling upward, swallowed by the black sky. Lucas Grant, said tomorrow, we move before dawn. The narrator described Edward Clark kneeling beside a frozen crater rim under a bleak midday sky, shards of ice glinting like fractured glass. Edward Clark said, "These readings are impossible. Magnetic fields spiking off the scale." Amelia Brooks said, "This pattern isn't natural, it's almost engineered." The narrator revealed Lucas Grant scanning the horizon, his breath ragged from the bitter cold. Lucas Grant said, "Someone manipulated this land long before we arrived." The narrator recounted a distant rumble vibrating through the permafrost. Edward Clark said, "It's like the ground remembers the blast." The narrator noted Amelia Brooks sketching symbols onto her notebook as the wind whipped her cloak. Amelia Brooks said, "These alignments could point to something buried deeper." The narrator described an unsettling silence falling across the tundra, as if the earth itself paused to listen. The narrator described the trio gathered around a weathered boulder, marked with ancient carvings half buried in snow. Amelia Brooks said, "These symbols predate any known Siberian culture." Edward Clark said, "Then someone has hidden a story in plain sight." Lucas Grant said, "Stories that can topple empires." The narrator explained how sunlight broke briefly through the clouds, illuminating the carvings with a ghostly glow. Edward Clark traced a line of symbols with his gloved finger, feeling a subtle vibration beneath. The narrator recounted a gust, lifting loose snow into a swirling halo. Amelia Brooks whispered, "The blast wasn't the first event here." Lucas Grant said, "And it may not be the last." The narrator emphasized the weight of ancient secrets, pressing down upon the frozen land. The narrator detailed a sudden crack echoing through the trees as Edward Clark and Amelia Brooks crossed a frozen riverbed, their boots crunching over thin ice. Edward Clark said, "That wasn't just ice shifting." Amelia Brooks said, "Something's moving beneath us." The narrator described Lucas Grant on the riverbank, eyes narrowing as he spotted a shadow dart under the ice. Lucas Grant said, "We're not alone here." The narrator revealed a distant figure watching from a snow ridge before vanishing into the mist. Edward Clark said, "They're tracking our every step." The narrator recounted the wind rising, carrying an electric hum that prickled their skin. Amelia Brooks whispered, "The keeper of secrets is closer than we thought." The narrator ended with tension, stretching like the frozen river beneath their feet. The narrator described Edward Clark, Amelia Brooks, and Lucas Grant sheltering beneath a jagged rock outcrop as a blizzard swept across the tundra. Snow whipped like knives against their faces. Amelia Brooks said, "This storm came out of nowhere." Edward Clark said, "Or someone wanted it to cover their tracks." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant unfurling a worn map, its corners tattered by wind and time. Lucas Grant said, "The blast zone perimeter isn't random, it matches these coordinates." The narrator revealed a low, pulsing hum reverberating through the rock beneath them. Edward Clark said, "That hum again, it's guiding us." The narrator observed Amelia Brooks clutching the map to keep it from the gale. Amelia Brooks whispered, "We're chasing ghosts and secrets that may not want to be found." The narrator described the storm momentarily clearing, revealing distant flickers of unnatural light on the horizon. The narrator described the trio reaching a secluded ravine where the earth had split from some ancient force. Frost coated every surface, and the air shimmered faintly with static. Edward Clark said, "This place feels alive, like it's breathing." Amelia Brooks said, "Look at the residue on these rocks, it's not natural ash." Lucas Grant said, "This is proof of something far beyond an asteroid strike." The narrator detailed their lanterns casting trembling halos on fractured stone walls. Edward Clark knelt, brushing frost away to reveal metallic fragments embedded in the rock. Amelia Brooks whispered, "These shapes, they match the carvings from before." The narrator explained how the static intensified, making their hair rise. Lucas Grant said, "The truth is buried deeper than we imagined." The narrator concluded with the chilling sense that something ancient stirred beneath their feet, waiting to be uncovered. The narrator described Edward Clark pacing beside a flickering camp lantern beneath a sky split by distant lightning. Amelia Brooks said, "You're restless, something's changed," Edward Clark said. "The coordinates Lucas Grant gave us point directly to an old government site." The narrator noted Lucas Grant's calm mask slipping, his jaw tightening briefly. Lucas Grant said that site was abandoned long ago, or so they claimed. The narrator recounted wind tearing through the tents, scattering papers into the darkness. Edward Clark said, "You're holding back, Lucas." Amelia Brooks whispered, "Secrets will get us killed." The narrator described thunder rolling like distant cannon fire, shaking the frozen ground beneath their boots. Lucas Grant said if you knew everything, you'd run before dawn. The narrator ended with tension thickening like the storm clouds overhead. The narrator described the trio trekking through jagged hills under a bruised dawn sky, their breaths steaming in the biting air. Amelia Brooks said, "These hills feel unnatural, like they were shaped by the blast." Edward Clark said, "Or by hands that wanted to hide something." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant checking a worn compass, its needle spinning wildly. Lucas Grant said, "The magnetic interference is stronger here. It's not random." The narrator noted ravens circling silently overhead, black specks against violet clouds. Edward Clark said, "The keeper of secrets isn't far behind." The narrator described Amelia Brooks tightening her cloak, determination hardening her gaze. Amelia Brooks whispered, "Then we stay ahead, no matter the cost." The narrator captured the eerie hum returning, vibrating through the frozen stones beneath them. The narrator described Edward Clark discovering a half-buried hatch among the rocks, its metal scorched and rusted. Edward Clark said, "This was built, not born from nature." Amelia Brooks said, "It could be a bunker tied to the explosion." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant's face tightening as he stepped back. Lucas Grant said, "Some doors stay closed for a reason." The narrator described the cold wind moaning through the stones, echoing like distant voices. Edward Clark said, "If answers lie below, we open it." Amelia Brooks whispered, "Edward, what if the truth is worse than we imagined?" The narrator revealed the sky darkening overhead, snow beginning to fall in delicate spirals. Lucas Grant said, "Once you see what's hidden, you can't unsee it." The narrator concluded with their gloved hands brushing frost from the hatch handle. The narrator described Edward Clark forcing the hatch open, revealing a narrow stairway descending into frozen darkness. Amelia Brooks said, "This place shouldn't exist out here." Edward Clark said, "It's a relic of secrets buried with the snow." The narrator detailed Lucas Grant hesitating at the entrance, his eyes darting to the storm above. Lucas Grant said, "Going down there could seal our fate." The narrator recounted the metallic smell wafting upward, sharp and alien. Edward Clark said, "We've come too far to turn back." The narrator described Amelia Brooks lighting a lantern, its glow trembling against the icy walls. Amelia Brooks whispered, "Then let's uncover what they wanted forgotten." The narrator ended with the stairway swallowing their footsteps, echoing like distant thunder beneath the earth. The narrator described the trio stepping into a subterranean chamber lined with corroded panels and shattered instruments. Frost clung to wires dangling like vines. Amelia Brooks said, "This was no simple research station." Edward Clark said, "They were experimenting with forces beyond comprehension." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant running his fingers over faded insignias on a panel. Lucas Grant said, "The keeper of secrets would kill to keep this hidden." The narrator explained a faint hum resonating through the chamber, stirring dust motes into shimmering spirals. Amelia Brooks whispered, "The energy here feels alive." The narrator described Edward Clark lifting a fractured device, its metal etched with the same symbols from the tundra boulder. Edward Clark said, "This connects everything, the blast, the symbols, the lies." The narrator ended with distant footsteps echoing from the stairway above. "Ano." The narrator described Edward Clark brushing snow from a half-exposed metallic fragment beneath the ravine wall, its surface humming faintly. Amelia Brooks said, "This alloy, it doesn't belong on Earth." Edward Clark said, It survived the blast intact. It's deliberate. The narrator recounted Lucas Grant watching the horizon, unease etched on his face. Lucas Grant said, "The keeper of secrets will stop at nothing to claim this." The narrator noted distant thunder, rolling even under clear skies. Amelia Brooks whispered, "Then we must document it before they come." The narrator described Edward Clark, photographing the fragment with trembling hands, knowing the world's understanding could shift tonight. Lucas Grant said, "Every truth has a price. We may not afford this one." The narrator ended with the wind swirling ash and snow around them, like a warning. The narrator described Edward Clark, Amelia Brooks, and Lucas Grant setting up camp within a shallow cave as evening shadows crept across the tundra. Amelia Brooks said, "These symbols repeat across every fragment we've found." Edward Clark said, "It's a message, maybe a warning." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant unfolding an old journal and matching the markings to an ancient map. Lucas Grant said, "This path leads under the blast epicenter." The narrator detailed sparks popping from the campfire, lighting their anxious faces. Amelia Brooks whispered, "If this was a weapon test, someone still guards its secret." Edward Clark said, "Then we go deeper tomorrow, no hesitation." The narrator ended with a cold wind moaning outside, as if the land itself mourned what was about to be revealed. The narrator described the trio venturing under the tundra through a newly uncovered fissure, lantern light bouncing off ice-coated walls. Edward Clark said, "This tunnel was carved, not natural." Amelia Brooks said, "Someone built pathways beneath Siberia long before the explosion." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant trailing behind, his breath uneven with apprehension. Lucas Grant said, "These tunnels were meant to stay buried." The narrator described faint echoes of dripping water, blending with a low mechanical hum. Edward Clark said, "The energy source is close. I can feel it." The narrator observed Amelia Brooks touching carvings glowing faintly beneath the frost. Amelia Brooks whispered, "They matched the device's etchings." The narrator ended with a gust of cold air sweeping through the fissure, as if the earth exhaled a secret. The narrator described Edward Clark, Amelia Brooks, and Lucas Grant entering a vast underground chamber where towering crystalline structures pulsed with faint light. Edward Clark said, "This is the heart of the blast's mystery." Amelia Brooks whispered, "It feels alive, like it's listening." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant approaching a pedestal bearing an orb etched with the same alien symbols. Lucas Grant said, "This is no weapon of man, it's something older." The narrator detailed the hum growing louder, vibrating through their bones. Edward Clark said, "The energy is unstable. We need to be careful." The narrator noted Amelia Brooks stepping closer, her lantern casting dancing shadows over the crystal walls. Amelia Brooks said, "This could rewrite history itself." The narrator concluded with distant echoes suggesting movement above, a reminder that they were not alone. The narrator described the chamber trembling as a sudden surge of energy flared, casting the trio into dazzling light. Amelia Brooks said, "The orb, it's reacting." Edward Clark said, "Step back. It's unstable." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant shielding his eyes as sparks arced across the crystal walls. Lucas Grant said, "This power was never meant for us." The narrator detailed the hum transforming into a deep, resonant tone that shook loose shards of ice. Amelia Brooks whispered, "It's awakening something beneath us." The narrator observed Edward Clark clutching the metallic fragment tightly, determination hardening his features. Edward Clark said, "We take proof or the truth dies here." The narrator ended with the light fading, leaving silence heavier than the frozen earth. The narrator described Edward Clark gripping the metallic fragment as the underground chamber's hum grew louder, shaking dust from the crystal walls. Amelia Brooks said, "Something's stirring beneath us." Edward Clark said, "It's waking up, or warning us away." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant stepping back toward the tunnel entrance, his eyes flicking nervously upward. Lucas Grant said, "We need to leave now. This place isn't stable." The narrator noted the air thickening with static, every breath crackling like electricity. Amelia Brooks whispered, "The keeper of secrets will be on us soon." The narrator detailed Edward Clark planting his lantern firmly, his jaw set with resolve. Edward Clark said, "We don't run, we expose the truth." The narrator ended with the chamber's hum deepening to a menacing growl, echoing through the frozen earth. The narrator described Edward Clark, Amelia Brooks, and Lucas Grant climbing from the chamber into a snow-swept gorge beneath a starless sky. The wind howled like a living thing. Amelia Brooks said, "We can't let the keeper of secrets erase this discovery." Edward Clark said, "The evidence must survive, even if we don't." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant scanning the ridges, spotting faint torchlight in the distance. Lucas Grant said, "They're here already." The narrator detailed snow crunching under their boots as tension knotted their stomachs. Amelia Brooks whispered, "Then we prepare for a fight they won't expect." The narrator observed Edward Clark tightening the strap on his pack, determination etched in his face. Edward Clark said, "We end their lies tonight." The narrator ended with distant howls carried on the freezing wind, closing in. The narrator described the trio crossing a frozen lake, lit only by their lanterns, the ice groaning beneath their feet. Edward Clark said, "Keep moving, don't look down." Amelia Brooks said, "The cracks are spreading." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant, glancing back to see shadows pursuing across the ice. Lucas Grant said, "They're closing in fast." The narrator detailed the wind whipping snow into stinging flurries. Edward Clark said, "If the lake gives way, we're finished." The narrator observed Amelia Brooks gripping her lantern tighter, her knuckles white. Amelia Brooks whispered, "The keeper of secrets will bury us here." The narrator ended with a deafening crack echoing across the lake as the shadows drew closer, the ice trembling under their weight. The narrator described Edward Clark, Amelia Brooks, and Lucas Grant reaching the far shore as the ice splintered behind them, sending a deafening crack across the tundra. Amelia Brooks said, "That was too close." Edward Clark said, "They'll be right behind us." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant pulling a revolver from beneath his coat, his breath quickening. Lucas Grant said, "We hold our ground here." The narrator detailed the torchlights appearing between the trees, their glow flickering like watchful eyes. Amelia Brooks whispered, "The keeper of secrets will silence us tonight if we fail." The narrator observed Edward Clark planting the metallic fragment in the snow, ready to defend it. Edward Clark said, "Then tonight they learn the truth fights back." The narrator ended with the forest wind roaring, carrying echoes of approaching footsteps. The narrator described a violent clash erupting beneath the Siberian pines, torchlight flashing against steel as figures closed in. Edward Clark said, "Protect the evidence at all costs." Amelia Brooks said, "They can't bury this again." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant firing a warning shot, its echo rolling across the tundra like thunder. Lucas Grant said, "Fall back. We regroup near the ravine." The narrator described the keeper of secrets agents retreating briefly, regrouping in the darkness. Edward Clark said, "They're scared. They know what we found." The narrator noted Amelia Brooks clutching the fragment, snowflakes melting on her trembling hands. Amelia Brooks whispered, "This isn't over. It's only the beginning." The narrator concluded with the wind carrying the sound of distant howls, the frozen land holding its breath for what came next. The narrator described Edward Clark sprinting across a fractured ridge under a sky bruised by storm clouds, lantern light swinging wildly. Amelia Brooks said, "The transmitter is close. We can't stop now." Edward Clark said, "If we fail, the truth dies with us." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant glancing back at flickering torchlights gaining ground through swirling snow. Lucas Grant said, "They're faster than we thought." The narrator detailed the wind screaming like a wounded beast, flinging icy shards against their faces. Amelia Brooks whispered, "We must get the evidence out before they close in." The narrator observed Edward Clark tightening his grip on the metallic fragment, his breath ragged. Edward Clark said, "We'll outrun their lies." The narrator ended with distant thunder, echoing like ancient drums, heralding the coming confrontation. The narrator described Edward Clark, Amelia Brooks, and Lucas Grant reaching a rusted transmitter, mast jutting from a snow-buried outpost. Edward Clark said, "This is our only chance to broadcast the proof." Amelia Brooks said, "If we fail, their version of history wins." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant connecting the metallic fragment to the frozen cables, sparks crackling. Lucas Grant said, "The signal will be weak, but it might reach beyond Siberia." The narrator noted wind tearing at Amelia Brooks' cloak as she read coordinates aloud. Edward Clark said, "Hold steady, this storm wants to erase us." The narrator ended with distant torchlight flickers on the horizon as the transmitter groaned to life, humming with defiance. The narrator described a sudden crack of gunfire shattering the icy silence as figures emerged from the tree line. Amelia Brooks said, "They've found us." Edward Clark said, "Keep the transmission going." The narrator recounted Lucas Grant diving behind a snowdrift, returning fire to cover the group. Lucas Grant said, "Hold your ground, they can't silence us all." The narrator noted sparks leaping from the transmitter as bullets ricocheted off its frame. Edward Clark said, "Almost there, hold the line." The narrator observed Amelia Brooks clutching the notebook against her chest, fear and resolve mixing on her face. Amelia Brooks whispered, "The world must know." The narrator ended with swirling snow and muzzle flashes, illuminating the tundra like strobe lights. The narrator described Lucas Grant stepping into the open, drawing the pursuers' fire to buy Edward Clark and Amelia Brooks time. Lucas Grant shouted, "Go, finish the broadcast." The narrator recounted Edward Clark hesitating, torn between duty and loyalty. Amelia Brooks said, "He's buying us our future, don't waste it." The narrator noted brilliant light erupting from beneath the tundra as ancient crystals surged upward, splitting the ground. Edward Clark said, "The land itself is answering back." The narrator described attackers stumbling as the ice fractured, their torches scattered. Lucas Grant whispered, "Some truths fight for themselves." The narrator ended with Edward Clark and Amelia Brooks racing into the storm as chaos engulfed the horizon. The narrator described weeks later, Edward Clark and Amelia Brooks standing before an international assembly, their evidence displayed on massive screens. Amelia Brooks said, "The truth behind Tunguska changes everything we thought we knew." Edward Clark said, "This was no simple meteor, it was a message and a warning." The narrator recounted murmurs rippling through the audience as images of the blast and symbols filled the hall. The narrator noted distant Siberian horizons flickering faintly under a polar twilight, suggesting the mystery persists. Amelia Brooks whispered, "The world is listening now." The narrator ended with Edward Clark gazing eastward, knowing some secrets remain buried beneath the ice.